replaced by something that was far more suitable for, actually flying a fighter. But while you might be able to swap out instruments later in development, changing the fundamental shape of the aircraft is something very different. And there, the problems are also pretty fundamental. For example, the 313 is apparently not just meant to be stealthy itself, it's meant to turn enemy planes into stealth aircraft as well, because that comparatively tiny nose doesn't leave much room to fit any sort of significant radar system. The intakes that are meant to feed the engine appear significantly undersized, and given the positioning and shape, if this aircraft pitches up rapidly, you can imagine that causing problems for airflow into the engines. But hey, maybe that's fine, because who on earth would want to pull off high angle of attack maneuvers in a fighter? And imagining for a moment a pilot was able to use his Cessna avionics to successfully get this thing flying despite its undersized intakes, and then find a target using his non-existent radar array, his options may be limited to ramming because despite the initial Iranian claims, there's no visible weapon mounts or critically, no visible weapon bays on the Conqueror 313. Even the version we saw in 2017 appears to be a claimed stealth aircraft with no internal weapon bays. And to go further, because of the small size of the aircraft, even if you were going to externally mount the weapons that they claimed, there arguably isn't enough physical space on the airframe to actually mount them all externally. And trust me, I can go on from the wing design to the engine nozzles, but here's the basic point. In 2013, when this thing was first showed off, it looked like a fake. In 2017, after many more years of development, all we saw was a mock-up of the aircraft that was capable of taxiing around the runway. And in 2023, we still have not seen a flying version of the aircraft, and the Iranians now claim their intention is to turn it into a drone. Because if you're going to build an aircraft that from an engineering standpoint probably can't fly and fight effectively, you may as well not waste a pilot doing so. Whether the 313 just represented a reasonably expensive propaganda effort or a genuine effort at fighter development that produced something that looked like a purely propaganda effort, the reality is, more than a decade on, Iran very clearly doesn't have its own fighter. And the whole affair seems to have drawn no shortage of mockery for Iran's aerospace sector, which does leave me somewhat confused as to what the Iranians were trying to accomplish here. Because even if they're more humble, the Iranian aerospace sector has been able to produce indigenous products that do work. Cloning and then iterating on early Cold War designs may not sound particularly impressive, but for a country with limited financial resources that has spent decades under sanctions, it still represents an industrial baseline. A capability that means at the very least the Iranians are going to have aircraft to train their pilots and munitions to mount on them. It's the difference between something humble but real and something that looks really impressive but is actually just smoke and mirrors. The latter only has any value if people choose to buy into the illusion. But there are a few particular areas, you've probably figured out by now, where Iranian industry has made considerable investments and as a result has some not insubstantial capabilities, namely the massive focus they placed on cheap drones and rockets. There are some arguments that drones and missiles align particularly well with Iran's strategic needs and strategy. Drones and rockets can be very economical compared to the cost required to defend against them, which is the kind of efficiency Iran arguably needs considering how much wealthier many of its rivals are. If you try and match the Saudis or the USA in a military spending war one-to-one, you're gonna have a bad time. They also align with Iran's geographical situation where they don't share a land border with many of their primary rivals, and so being able to launch attacks over long distances clearly has significant value. Add to that the relatively greater level of technical accessibility. Iran seems to have no trouble getting access to civilian drone parts or getting access to North Korean rocket designs from which to develop its own systems, and you have something that might be much simpler for Iran to design and produce itself than a next-generation fighter. Plus, these systems are much easier to transport and teach proxy forces to use and deploy than something more complicated. While it is truly incredible how often rockets and drones seem to fall off the back of a truck in Yemen, ending up in the hands of the Houthis, those weapon systems are at least plausibly usable in austere conditions. Missile attacks on Israel from Yemen, as we've seen in the past few days, are at least somewhat potentially maybe deniable and practical. A sortie of Houthi F-14 Tomcats would raise considerable additional questions. And finally, and this is the point that causes a lot of agitation in many foreign capitals, having a sufficiently advanced missile program is one solution to the problem of how to deliver a nuclear weapon if you were ever to develop one. And the longer ranged your high payload missiles are, the more countries you can potentially hold in your crosshairs. So with that understanding in place, let's have a look at a couple of Iranian capabilities. According to United States Central Command, Iran has developed, quote, the largest and most capable unmanned aerial vehicle force in the region, end quote. And that while unit for unit, Iranian drones may not always be the most technologically advanced in the world, They provide what the CRS describes as, quote, a cost-effective way of projecting power, especially given Iran's underdeveloped air force, end quote. In practice, what this means is the Iranians have developed a wide array of indigenously assembled drone systems, although often using imported components. Shahed 136, for example, has already become very famous for its use by Russia. Reporting on Shaheds disassembled in Ukraine showed dozens of Western electrical components. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Iran is able to obtain these components, that many of them are not sensitive technology subject to export controls, and that as a result, Iran is capable of producing a system capable of striking up to 2,000 kilometers away in quantity for a relatively affordable price. It should also be stressed that when you're talking about Iranian drones, and Shahed included, these are not really the equivalent to just taking a civilian quad rotor off the market and using it for military purposes. They represent purpose-built military hardware, and as a result, don't always have the same vulnerability as adapted civilian systems, even if they feature a lot of civilian and dual-use components. That often means, for example, they include design features intended to protect them at least somewhat against electronic